Okay, so welcome everyone and welcome to our MLE Friends this evening. This is an MLE Friends talk at Mind and Life Europe, and it's our pleasure to welcome Dr. Giuseppe Pagnoni this evening to offer a talk entitled Inactive Inference, the Epistemic Value of Contemplative Practice. So I'll just spend a moment introducing Professor Pagnoni, and then I will let him take the floor to offer his presentation this evening. So Giuseppe Pagnoni is an associate professor in the Department of Biomedical Sciences at the University of Modena and Reggio Emilia in Italy. After a master's in physics, he completed a PhD in neuroscience and has worked for several years in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Emory University in Georgia in the US. He's led and collaborated on neuroimaging studies on diverse topics, including reward processing, the interaction of immune and brain function, social cognition, intrinsic brain activity, pain processing, mental effort, and meditation, which we'll hear a bit about this evening specifically. He's currently interested in the application of the predictive coding framework to the study of contemplative practices. So with that, I will give you the floor. Giuseppe, thank you so much for offering this presentation with us.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I will share my screen to start the presentation, and thank you all for coming to this event. So the title is a bit of a mouthful, but the idea here is that rather than presenting some data, what I would like to do is present you an influential theory in neuroscience, which is becoming really prominent these days. This theory is called active inference, and it's the brainchild of Carl Friston at University College London, chiefly. Then, of course, a lot of other people are helping developing it. And it's a theory that has a very large potential scope of application, both from the explanatory aspect, but also for its application. During this talk, I will argue that it is also particularly suited to study contemplative practice and to understand the processes that are engaged by contemplative practice. Now, the title Inactive Inference, it's a kind of a play on the fact that the apparent inactivity of meditation, in fact, hides a process of a peculiar epistemic value. It's peculiar because we will see that it is more about collecting knowledge about internal states and part of the collecting knowledge about part of the system itself that accrues knowledge. So okay. So here I'm having trouble with okay, here it is. So the active inference is based on the so-called free energy principle, which you may have heard of, and it's a kind of esoteric in its formulation, but in fact, it's really simple in its essence. It means simply that biological systems minimize surprise, or that said, in other words, that in order to maintain their identity and their function, living beings have to minimize in the long term the probability of finding themselves in states that are too unusual or surprising. At the outset, the notion of minimization of surprise as an organizing principle may seem strange, but it's easy to understand if we restrict ourselves as an illustrative example to the notion of homeostasis. So every organism has a set of internal parameters, and you can think about I don't know, blood pH or temperature or oxygen levels and so on, that in order for the organism to keep its functioning and remain viable, it needs to maintain this parameter within a certain range, which is actually quite narrow. To find itself outside of this boundary, it's equivalent to finding itself in a very surprising state. So like in the picture, the classical example is a fish out of water. The fish will try with all its means to avoid finding itself in such a surprising state. We can also say that, in an alternative formulation, that living beings are a self-evident demonstration of their capacity of shielding themselves from the entropic dissolution. That is the tendency towards disorder that is mandated by the fluctuation theorem of thermodynamics. It's interesting to me, the fact that this notion of minimization of surprise, which is really at the core of all the theory of active inference, is very archetypical in a sense. If we think about the notion of cosmos and chaos, that is of order and disorder, we found this notion at the root of almost any foundational myths in many traditions. So it's quite interesting to note that these are really core notions for life. Now, the free energy principle can be explained in two ways. One is the purely physical, one appeals to the pure physical principle of self-organization, and the other can be cast in terms of predictive coding, basically, which is a notion based on Bayesian statistics. If we take this approach, we see that surprise minimization rests on a notion of a generative model. What is a generative model? A generative model is a model that the organism has, but I will later say that the organism is rather than has, but it's a model of its environmental niche, more precisely of the causal chain, of the causal dependency that the organism encounters in its environmental niche. And to make an example about this, let's talk about first a simple case of perception. So imagine that we are looking at this shadow on a wall. If I have a generative model of how the causes in the external world generate the visual sensation, if I invert that model, and perception is actually the process of going back from sensation to the causes in the world that generated those sensations. So there is an aspect of recognition that is lacking in the pure sensation. So when we perceive, the process that we make is basically to assign to those sensations the potential causes that generated the sensation. So if when I'm presented with a sensory stimulus that is a sensation, the inversion of the generative model makes me able to infer the presence of a potential cause for generating that sensation. And notice that I said infer, because it's always an educated guess. So in other words, we cannot really have a direct contact with the external world, because we are forever screened from the external world by our sensory veil, our sensory apparatus. We can only infer what are the potential causes of our sensation. But when in this example, I'm inferring that is a hand that is positioned between a source of light and the wall, thus generating the impression of this shadow, then, like in a circular fashion, this inferred presence of a hand will make me generate a visual expectation that if I turn around, I will actually see a hand, which can be frustrated though. As you can see, maybe that the external causes generating my sensation is a completely different entity. So the discrepancy between my expected cause, my inferred cause, and the actual reality check from the world constitutes what is called a prediction error. And minimization of surprise basically rests on minimization of prediction error, that is trying to make as thin as possible the discrepancy between prediction or expectations and the actual sensory signal. Now, the core business of living beings in this theory of active inference is the minimization of prediction error. We can also say that. So everything that an organism does can be cast in terms of minimization of different kinds of prediction error. Now, obviously, in order to be able to cast predictions and have prediction error, of course, we need a generative model. By inverting it, we can infer the causes. But what kind of structure is needed for this generative model? So we need, obviously, a model that is hierarchically structured. Why? Because organisms, at least, let's talk about complex organisms, live in an environment, but not only live in an environment that is complex, but their interaction with the environment is so complex that the organism, in order to be able to maintain its form and function, needs to be able to represent complex causal chains of events spanning several spatiotemporal scales. And therefore, in order to represent those causal chains of events, it needs a model that has a complex hierarchical structure. In this illustrative figure, I'm just using 3 levels, but this is just an obvious extreme simplification, in which the lower level of this internal model are the ones that are more closely connected to the world through the sensory apparatus. And you see the higher levels, the activity of the higher levels encodes prediction for the state of the lower levels. The prediction are compared with the actual state of the lower levels, and the discrepancy is sent back to the upper layers as a prediction error. That is a teaching signal to correct at the next cycle of prediction the those expectations. There's also a matter of spatiotemporal grain that is related to this hierarchical structure, in the sense that lower levels of this hierarchical model code for fast changing regularities, that is, events that occur on a small spatiotemporal scale, while higher level code for events or chains of events that are of a coarser spatiotemporal grain. So more longer term expectations and recollection. We can also say that if we go from the lower levels to the upper levels, we traverse upward this hierarchy, we basically go from percept to concepts. Concepts can be seen as a longer term declination of a percept. That is a representation that belong to a much wider spatiotemporal scale. They are kind of generalizations. It's also this, this hierarchical structure is also related to the temporal depth of the system, of the organism. That is, how we will see how far back and how forward can the organism cast its inferences. So if we take a very simple organism like a unicellular organism like an amoeba, it does not need to cast inferences very much out in the future. It needs just to be able to predict what goes on immediately after the present. So in a sense, the amoeba is the perfect meditator. I can quit because it's always in the present. But as organisms become more complex, and of course, when they develop a complex nervous system, then they are able to cast these long arcs of prediction and also post-diction, in the sense of inferring the past causes of the current state of affairs. These arcs become longer and longer. It's interesting because the temporal depth of the generative model has been linked in the active inference theory to the degree of consciousness of the system. So a system that has a high temporal depth and that means having a lot of hierarchically structured layers, is also a system that possesses a high degree of consciousness. The last thing that I would like to point out here is that, as you can see, these descending signals represent not only predictions, as you can see here, but also precision expectation. What is precision expectation? Is a representation of how reliable is going to be, how reliable the prediction error is going to be. Why? Because, of course, if we expect that the prediction error is very reliable, the system would logically need to amplify the prediction error, because it's a reliable teaching signal to improve the prediction in the future. While if the prediction error is deemed imprecise or noisy, then it's better to attenuate it, so that because it does not carry reliable information to update the model. Of course, one could ask, okay, this is a very nice theoretical scheme, computational scheme, but does the brain have the required structure anatomically and functionally to support this kind of generative model? We think it does. The human brain, well, general, also non-human brain, like mammalian brain, is very hierarchically structured, and there's, according to more recent estimates, there are 10 to the 10th power of neurons in a brain, in a human brain, which amounts to more or less 10 to the 14th power of synapses. And that testifies to our capability of representing very, very complex chains of events in our environmental niche. Of course, we are probably the species that have the most complex interactions with its environment. And so in order to be able to navigate efficiently this environment, we need to embed or embody a generative model that is as complex as those interactions. There are also some advantages to a computational architecture like this, like a predictive architecture. First of all, we have a high computational efficiency because we don't need, we don't need to process all the inputs that reaches our sensory surfaces, but just the discrepancy between the prediction and the sensory signal, the expected sensory signal and the actual sensory signal. That is the only signal that travels upward in the hierarchy. So computationally, this is quite efficient. Also, there is another advantage, which is computational speed, because the system is always working proactively. And in fact, it has been argued that that due to the speed of transmission in the neurons, of the signal in the neurons, we could not be able to react very quickly if it was not for this predictive mechanism. Okay, so where does this generative model come from? In other words, what is the process that generates the generative model? It's basically the interaction, or you could say the friction between the organism and its environment that literally informs, sculpts, in a way, its structure and causal dynamics, so that eventually it comes to reflect, represent, or reenact the causal chain of events that the organism encounters. Not that I said causal chain of events rather than independent entities, because it seems that what is represented is really causal dependencies. And here, you know, the Buddhist notion of paticca samuppada comes to mind, of codependent origination. So no ontologies really, but just relationships. And the other thing that I would like to point out with the help of this picture is that the agent really comes to embody a generative model of its world. And I would like you to notice the crucial difference between the classic representationalist view of cognition, where the organism uses a model of the world, like, and of course, that this begs the question of where and what is the central controller that uses this representation. This is not the case here. The living being or sentient being is a model of its world. Also, it's important to stress that for social species like us, other individuals are really a salient feature of our environmental niche. So the relationship with the others is really constitutive of our own identity. From a phylogenetical point of view, it's also interesting that, when during the so-called Cambrian explosion around 600 million years ago, most of the animal phyla appeared. It was at that moment, at the precise moment, that inferring the identity, the behavior, and the intention of other animals became the cardinal issue for survival. Because before that, the representation needs were not so high. But at that moment, it became very high. And in fact, it seems that this explosion of the number of interacting species was the leading force for the evolution of the nervous and sensory motor system. So basically, we could also say in a sentence that the mind was shaped in response to other minds. But let's go back to our mechanism of surprise minimization through the minimization of prediction error. So if we now restrict to the simple case of the minimization of the current prediction error, we can do this in two ways. So the first way is, we can say, the perceptual way. And the idea is that when we have a prediction, and then we have a sensory evidence, we use that prediction error to change the initial prediction. That is, to change our mind according to the reality check of our prediction from the world. The other way is the action way, or let's say the active inference way. The idea is that now what we do is to act in order to change the world so that it will make it more similar to what we expect. So we move, so to bring the evidence, the sensory evidence that we expect onto our sensory receptors. Now, these two ways are really very intertwined because of the circularity of the sensory motor process. In fact, we have an actively guided perception and a perceptually guided action. So it's one follows the other in a circle. But the relative prevalence of one or the other at a given moment depends on the newsworthiness or reliability of the incoming sensory signal, or better, the expected newsworthiness or reliability of the incoming sensory signal compared as pitted against the strength of our beliefs. So here comes into play the crucial notion of precision, which I anticipated a few slides ago. So when we expect a precise sensory signal, that is, when the signal is deemed trustworthy, so it means that this signal makes for a good teaching signal and to revise our predictions or beliefs. On the other hand, when the signal is deemed unreliable or noisy, our prior beliefs are held firm and they guide action to provide confirmatory evidence. So in a sense, this is the realm of self-fulfilling prophecies. But let's not hastily judge this as a bad strategy, because it's really a very rational strategy to use action to improve our inference when we expect a noisy sensory signal. As a simple example, think about what we do when we wake up at night and we don't see anything, and we may want to grab our slippers and go to the bathroom maybe. So the first thing that we do is try to find the light switch with our hand, but the sensory signal is completely unreliable because it's dark. So what we do instead is follow our internal representation, our beliefs as to where as concerning the spatial location of the light switch. And so we go there blindly, and it's perfectly rational to do so. Now, then when we turn on the light, then the sensory signal becomes very precise. And so it's more rational now to switch to a perceptual inference mode. Also, precision, the expected precision of the sensory signal corresponds to an amplification of prediction error, or raising the gain on prediction error, because if a signal is reliable, its impact on our beliefs or expectations needs to be big. On the other hand, if sensory signal or prediction error is deemed unreliable or noisy, it needs to be attenuated, because we do not want to give it a strong power in changing our expectation or our beliefs. More interesting, perhaps for our purposes, is that this modulation of precision corresponds to the cognitive function of attention. For me, it's interesting also because reliable in Italian is attendibile, which also means worth of attention. So there's even a clear link in the language about these two. Now, before talking about how all of this has to do with meditation, we need just one last notion, that of pragmatic and epistemic value of a policy, which means simply a course of action. So the minimization of the current free energy, and it's called in technical jargon variational free energy, free energy can always be cast as a combination of prediction errors. So when you hear free energy, think about prediction error. So minimization of current free energy or prediction error can account for both perception, elementary motor acts, and learning. In this case, from the mathematical point of view, this current free energy can be decomposed in two terms, which correspond to the complexity of the model and the accuracy of the model. So minimizing current free energy corresponds to, at the same time, minimizing the complexity of the model. It's kind of a trade-off between minimizing the complexity of the model and maximizing its accuracy. So it's the complexity of the model basically measures how much we have to change our beliefs in order to account for the current sensory evidence. This is basically a formulation of the Occam's razor. So we want our model to be as simple as it can, while still having a sufficient accuracy in representing the world. Now, the point is that for complex sentient beings, minimization of current free energy is not enough, because this type of living beings have, of course, a very developed faculty of planning and deciding about elaborate courses of action for the future according to their desires and motivation. So the generative model must include the agent itself in its set of representation in order to be able to anticipate the consequences of its own actions. In this case, in order to select the proper action and to perform an effective decision-making process, the organism or the system needs to minimize both the current free energy, but also the free energy of the future, the expected free energy. And the expected free energy can be decomposed into the pragmatic value of the chosen course of action or policy, its reward value, and its epistemic value, that is the capacity of that course of action to gain together useful information for improving future prediction. The policy or course of action that will be selected will be the one that best minimizes the expected free energy and the current free energy. That is a policy which, again, corresponds to an optimal trade-off between its pragmatic value and its epistemic value. This is also the classic paradigm of explore or exploit. Exploit means that we go for we select the policy that are more likely to get for us, that are more likely to give us our desired observation or states, while sometimes we don't have enough information to do that. So first we need to explore, and that is gain enough new data that is not encoded in our model. We need first to select a policy that has a sufficient epistemic value that then allows us to reach our desired state. Again, here it's very intriguing to me that these notions that are fundamental in the active inference theory are really archetypic again. So think about, for instance, the tree of knowledge and the tree of life in the Garden of Eden. So the tree of knowledge, of course, is more likely to the epistemic value of a policy, and the pragmatic instead is the tree of life, the capacity of our action to acquire as to make our state more aligned with our phenotype. So say, for example, drinking water if we are thirsty, so that life can continue. We can also say, and we link here to the theory of autopoiesis, that life is can be seen as a process of self-evidencing. So in the active inference framework, a living organism is a generative model of its world that continuously solicits evidence to confirm itself. This is, in my view, but Evan Thompson disagrees, but in my view, this is very similar to autopoiesis, where a living organism is seen as a network of processes that continuously recreate the conditions for their own existence. It's also interesting that in both these theoretical frameworks, error or mistake is the fabric on which meaning is built. Here, of course, prediction error is the only informative signal, but in the theory of autopoiesis, cognitive activity occurs in the ruptures of autopoiesis, when autopoiesis breaks transiently down, and its accommodation then it's what can be seen in a very general sense as the cognitive activity of the system. So error is very important, and it may be that if we make a small digression here, that when the gift of a good teacher, not only spiritual teacher, but in any way, in any sense, may be his or her capacity of virtuously frustrating our expectation, providing by doing so the opportunity for us to improve. And now, before going to examine the process of meditation itself, I would like to briefly sketch some parallels that just came to my mind while studying this with the Buddhist notion of the three marks of existence. First, we have the notion of anatta, which, of course, is the unsubstantiality of all phenomena. And in the theory of active inference, this can be seen as a process of self-confirmation without any fixed ontology. Anicca, that mental phenomena are impermanent, and even in active inference, the mental phenomena are always impermanently, transiently created by the meeting of this opposing flow of information, evidence and beliefs, or prediction and sensory evidence. And finally, dukkha, which is this kind of it's the meaning of dukkha is a bit complex, but we can interpret here as the undercurrent of existential anxiety for potential failures of self-confirmation. Because if a living being is a self-evidencing system that is poised constantly to find evidence for its own existence, of course, that carries along the possibility that one day this confirmation may not come. But underlying, I think, all of this notion is the notion of shunyata in the interpretation of Nagarjuna, probably, where everything is devoid of ontological weight and is created, so to say, on the fly by a network of causal processes. Finally, let's get down to business, or to actually not business. I would like to propose that the essence of meditation is a symbolic suspension of daily pragmatics, that is, of policies with the usual, habitual pragmatic values. There is an apparent inaction of meditation, but in fact, it is a very active and peculiar process. It reminds the notion of otium in Latin, which can be translated as idleness, but did not carry really this negative sense, because it represented a time devoted to spiritual, philosophical, or artistic activity. And it was compared in opposition to the busyness of negotium, which is basically mean business, but negation of otium, negotium. Here I will refer to the practice of Zazen in the Zen Soto tradition, because is the one that I know best. And Zazen can be seen as the practice of skillfully orchestrating the suspension of all the usual policies associated with our tendency to move towards what we like and away from what we dislike. The posture itself can be seen as a symbolic embodiment of the notion of mushotoku, which in Japanese means basically nothing to be attained. So if we examine the posture, we have the legs are folded with the feet turned upside down. This represents a suspension of the intentionality of walking motion. It's the hands resting in this cosmic mudra, Hokajoin, symbolizes the refraining from grasping, that is, getting and remaining attached to what we like and pushing away what we don't like. The mouth is shut with the upper and lower teeth barely touching. And this symbolizes the shelving of our speaking habits. The eyes are kept half open without looking around to avoid the seductive pull of dreamlike imagery that may surface otherwise during sitting, and also to avoid the visual foraging of the systems, of the environment. You know that visual saccades are our chief means of epistemic foraging towards regarding the external world. Finally, shifting from the purely bodily domain, although it's always mind-body, we have a stance of affective equanimity, and that means putting aside value judgments and rumination. So, as you can see, this posture of this way of practice is actually very active. And it's interesting to examine a famous sutra about this. This is the Appamada Vagga in the Dhammapada, and a common translation is heedfulness is the path to the deathless. Heedlessness is the path to death. The heedful die not, the heedless are as if dead already. But if so, this seems simply a question of disembodied attention. But if we examine the actual meaning of the word, of the term appamada, we see that it's a negation of pamada. And pamada means slothful, indolent, negligent, indifferent, and careless. So that I also found another translation which points more to the active nature of the practice. And it says, endeavor is the eternal way, neglect is the way to death. People who spur themselves on happily never die. People wallowing in self-indulgence, even though they have life, are as if dead already. Now, if this is what is done in a meditative practice, what is it supposed to bring about? So I will propose that this kind of contemplative praxis maximizes the chance of a special kind of learning. Here we see a vase, a Greek vase from around 500 BC, that depicts Ulysses having himself tied to the ship's mast in order to be able to hear the siren song without being fatally attracted to the rocks. I find this picture useful to remind us that meditation is not a strategy, is not chiefly, let's say, a strategy to assuage anxiety by reducing uncertainty. Rather, it's a way of constraining the dynamics of our mind and body, that is Ulysses bound to the mast, tied to the mast, against habitual reactive patterns so that we can learn something about ourselves. In a sense, under this kind of virtual boundary that is staged by contemplative inaction, the process of active inference effectively takes an inward-directed epistemic turn, providing a unique opportunity for the meditator's generative model to learn about itself, not about the environment, but about itself. In a famous scripture by Dogen Zenji, one of the two patriarchs of Zen Soto, we read in the Fukanza Zengi, we read, learn the backward step that turns the light inwardly to illuminate yourself. And this stance is allowed and fostered by, obviously, a heedful attitude. So, of course, attention needs to be in the game. If this is the case, now, this perspective can also cast a new light on the function of mind wandering. So mind wandering can be seen as the default epistemic policy, or I would say auto-epistemic policy, when we are not engaged in the usual reward-seeking and punishment-avoiding modality. That is, when we are at rest. In this case, the content of our spontaneous stream of consciousness provides valuable opportunities for reflection, creative problem solving, and planning. Contemplative practice, then, can be seen as a skilled optimization of this process, where the natural alternation of episodes of mind wandering and meditative presence generates an epistemically rich dynamics, where the generative model that we are starts to subtly learn not about the external world, but about itself. Notice also that here I use the term default epistemic policy, not by chance, but because mind wandering or spontaneous thoughts have been associated in the neuroimaging literature to the so-called default mode network. So that's why I use also that term. This knowledge that is accrued during meditation does not need to be fully conscious. It's more likely to be pre-conscious or intuitive. And I think it concerns especially the dynamical relationship between mental activity and its bodily effect. In other words, getting deeply acquainted with the relationship between mental and bodily phenomena effectively means to familiarize with the dynamics of emotions, as emotions also have been cast in the active inference framework as inferential process, that is, processes that interpret the interoceptive signals or bodily signal in the context of our set of priors or beliefs. So the emotion is basically the interpretation of the internal state of the bodies, but only when framed in the context of our existing set of beliefs. So in this perspective, the important point of meditation is not to seal up attention, for instance, on the breathing, from any intrusion, but rather to make it permeable to the richness of one's own lived life, and perhaps to something beyond that, something that comes, who knows from where. And in summary, these mind-wandering episodes in meditation may be not impediments, but the very fuel on which the meditative exercise functions. How much time do I have? Sorry.
You can have as much time as you need.
Okay, good.
You will have time for
Good.
discussion, so maybe
Okay.
another 5 minutes or so.
Okay. So this giving enough citizenship or the same citizenships to these two domains of our set of beliefs and what the world tells us, I think it's very, very important. We should not be manichaeistic in this sense. This is, I think, very nicely summarized completely outside of the theory of active inference by the psychologist James Hillman. And in a quote that I'm very fond of, he says, sensing the world and imagining the world, of course, it's built on our expectation or beliefs, are not divided in the aesthetic response of the heart. To sense penetratingly, we must imagine, and to imagine accurately, we must sense. Also in the chapter Kuge, that means flower in the sky or celestial flowers, in Dogen's Shobogen's, again, there is a paragraph that says, I'm paraphrasing here a bit, but basically says, do not look for enlightenment outside of delusion. That is a short-sighted view. So there is always this inevitable entwinement of our prejudices or beliefs and the world. And Hillman also says this, also quip that we call reality that fantasy which we don't see as the fantasy. Again, pointing out that what we perceive as the world really is our creation, although our creation is not totally free, because it's always sculpted and constrained by the interaction that we have with the world. So this is not to negate the existence of a reality out there. It simply says that we are always inevitably making things up, although our building blocks for doing so have been and are continuously shaped and informed by the history of interaction with our niche. Now, the last thing I would like to say is talk about a peculiar effect that goes with our capacity for agency. Because of our very skilled capacity for acting, we tend to fashion our world as we expect it to be, thereby making it more and more predictable so that our preferred states become more and more accessible. In fact, past adulthood, the generative model tends to become progressively less complex because there is synaptic loss, more driven by prior beliefs, more prone to overgeneralization, and more refractory to revision. Now, in light of the notion that we have just discussed, it is intriguing that many spiritual traditions point to the necessity of an unlearning process to escape the limitations that are imposed by a well-established but somewhat rigidified cognitive structure. And here I'm citing example from three different religious traditions. One from the Zen tradition, from Shunryu Suzuki, very famous. In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind, there are few. The other from the Tao Te Ching of Lao Tzu, in pursuit of learning, every day there is more. In the pursuit of the Tao, every day there is less. And finally, in our own Christian tradition, in the Gospel of Matthew, truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. And of course, you can also recall the famous quote from Picasso. It took me 4 years to paint like Raphael, but a lifetime to paint like a child. So the idea here is that since concepts are by definition bounded, to define comes from the Latin finis or limit, any notion that is overlearned also represents a hindrance for the understanding of what was left out of that boundary in the first place. But how can this working regress take place? It cannot be through a straightforward simplification of the generative model, because that, as we have just seen, already occurs as we age and leads to overgeneralization and pure accuracy. Here, I propose that contemplative practice instead may render our sets of beliefs more malleable and liable to revision, so that the internal dynamic of our system, of our mind-body system, becomes more itinerant, so to say. And this is affected by realizing, with the help of contemplative practice, the conditional nature of our perception and action, that is conditional on our set of beliefs. And to conclude, I would like to just say that sometimes some notions that are very popular in contemplative circles are also in danger of being misunderstood. One of these notions is the notion of living in the present. I think it is certainly possible to be held hostage by the present moment if we become too focused on either the attainment of immediate pleasures or on our current uncomfortable contingencies. Of course, a clear look and acceptance of the present is necessary and useful, but if it's all that is advocated, it definitely falls short. There is actually some experimental evidence that mindfulness practice may make individuals that are already quite self-centered even less pro-social. And also the concept of selflessness, anyway, is prone to be mistaken. Kodo Sawaki, a famous Zen teacher, used to say that Zazen is the self selving the self by the self. So indicating that it's not so easy to understand what the self is. Now, this tendency towards the immediate gratification in modern society, epitomized by the slogan, living in the present, corresponds to a strong reward delay discounting bias, where more distant rewards are steeply devalued. And I think that meditative practice may work as an antidote to this by sitting boringly without doing anything. We avoid reinforcing the old set of beliefs and behavior that we usually follow immediately with habitual reaction. And by doing this, we open up the door for alternative possibilities. This is also how the epistemic value of contemplative practice that we talked about can beget pragmatically valuable repercussions when we are outside of the caution. The present really is quite poor, is the word of an amoeba, if we forcefully prevent it from becoming enriched and enlivened by both the past and the future. And here, and I really finish here, I would like to read you this quote from Nelson Mandela, which talked about his long years in prison, which speaks directly to the importance of long-term expectation, something that we commonly may call faith. I always knew that someday I would once again feel the grass under my feet and walk in the sunshine as a free man. which is way different from the simplistic policy of caring only for the present moment and the happiness or discomfort therein. And I just leave you this reference if you are interested for further reading. This is a manuscript that is available, open access, at this link. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Giuseppe.
Sorry, it was a bit long, but...
No, thank you so much for this really substantive talk and summary of your work, and especially the link in the end. So hopefully during the discussion phase, you can maybe copy paste the link into the chat.
Oh, yes.
Or friends here can save for themselves. And also please feel free to close this screen sharing. Thank you so much. It was really, really deep and wide and thought-provoking. So I would like to open up the floor for discussion. We have got one good question already in the chat, so I would invite Ruben Flores to share your question first. And please feel free to add more to the chat or just indicate that you would like to ask a question by raising your hand or clicking on the raise hand icon or button down on your screen, and we will have a chance to hear from you all. So Ruben first.
So yeah, thanks a million, Giuseppe, for this very, very nice, wonderful talk. Just wondering, yeah, I found your account very convincing, but just wondering, you talked about meditation like in general, but as we know, there's many different types and many different traditions. And I was just wondering how to start making distinctions between how these different types could relate to this inference processes. But yeah, no, that was great. But yeah.
Yes, thank you very much for the question. Yeah, the framework is very, very general. Of course, it becomes specific the moment when you try to understand what's going on by sketching an actual causal model of the dynamics of the process that you want to examine. That specific model would need arguably to be different for different meditative techniques, but the basic principle upon which it rests would be the same. So of course, if we're talking about, I don't know, shamatha, for instance, if we're talking about visualization practice, if we're talking about other kind of practices, while the general idea would be the same, the specifics of the model that we may want to use to simulate the effects or the process would be slightly different. I used as an example Zen meditation, as I said, because it's the only one that I'm fairly familiar with. So
it would certainly be an interesting topic to analyze alternative forms of meditation.
Yes, and with Antoine Lutz, we are actually plan to do that.
Yeah, so it may be a research project in itself.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Ruben, for pointing at that wide dimension of possibilities.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else? I don't see more questions in the chat at this point, but you may have comments or yes, questions or.
Yes, I see this quote from Chogyan Trungpa, the job of a spiritual teacher is to destabilize the student. Yeah, very much in line.
Yes, it was Annie's comment during your talk, and it was really sharp and pointed to what you were saying. Father Francis, yes, please.
Yes, this is a very helpful talk because it brings together actual research that you're doing and then the reflection on meditation, which evidently also you've done. In in listening carefully, the organism is conceived as within an environment.
Yes.
But an organism is also an environment.
Yes.
So where would you map perception in this environment within environment?
Okay, so the definition of, let's say, the positing different levels of boundaries, there is actually a mathematical formulation for this, which is called the Markov blanket, and it's a formulation of causal independence of the internal states of the system from the external states of, that is, the states of its environment. This can be, of course, it's a kind of a situation of a matryoshka, because we are, as a, let's say, we are an organism as a person, but of course, our organs are themselves a kind of a self-organizing system. The cells of which the organs are made are self-organizing systems. So each of these systems has this kind of Markov blanket or boundary that defines their identity. It's for what concerns perception, of course, sometimes we may infer the causes of our sensation in the external world or internally. So be that in the body or even more abstractly in our mind. So that I think, I don't know if that was the point of your question or.
Well, to map means to locate in some sense, right?
Right. Right.
But here it looks like, of course, that there is a density of perception in the perceiving organism. And then there is a tending, you use the word attendibile,
yes.
Yes. Tending toward, all right, some stimuli that come in from the external environment and interact with the internal environment. So the trick here is that in inference, then once you've got that collection of perceptions, then you have memory of those perceptions, and then you have to further decisions are made. Yes. On the basis of the memory of prior perceptions. And this is what seems like you were studying. So I was hoping to obtain a little bit more on perception from you, because it's a really important problem, you know.
Yeah.
Logical.
So the perception are, of course, always framed, as you said, exactly on the previous impressions or memories. But these memories are constantly updated by the new sensory. Of course, they can be more or less updated. If the evidence, we consider the evidence very strong, that means we expect the evidence to possess a high precision, then we basically assign it a greater weight in changing our sets of belief. If we don't, on the other hand, they won't change really our existing frame of mind, so to say. So, for instance, some people that are doing psychedelic research argue that pharmacological intervention with these substances that change modulatory neurotransmission actually directly influence the modulation of precision, thereby render the existing set of beliefs or priors in a way injecting entropy in the system. So make it in more how do you say, rendering the landscape more equitable, so that you're not stuck to a few habitual schemes or patterns, but you can wander more freely and perhaps select alternative possibilities that usually you don't consider.
Very good.
Thank you.
I can see Annie Block's hand. So Annie.
Yes, on the Tibetan side, I've been told that the whole process is a process of deconditioning.
Deconditioning.
Yes.
Exactly.
And also in Dzogchen, which is one aspect of the Buddhist path, we're talking about non-action, non-meditation.
Very, very interesting.
These very terms are kind of a koan by themselves.
Yeah.
But more fundamentally for me, it reconnects me with a very long thread when I was training in cybernetics and system thinking at MIT. I found a paper which is the foundational paper of autopoiesis, which is what the frog's eye tells the frog's brain. And Maturana was a co-signer of this paper. And it tells that somehow the frog is programmed so that the frog's tongue is at a certain angle, and at that angle, the frog sees the insects, and then the tongue goes and up and catches the fly, and whatever is not in this angle, she doesn't perceive.
She doesn't perceive. Exactly.
When I read that, I say, "Woo! I mean, what is outside of our frame of reference?
Yes.
I mean, it means we're kind of hanging in the air."
Yes.
Like that. At the time, I didn't know anything about Buddhism, but that stuck with me. And when I met the Tibetans, high-level lamas, it's very clear that their angle of perception is wider than ours, at least than mine, very clearly. And among other things, it manifests by seeing in the future very clearly. I've observed that. It's not something I'm making up, but also for some of us, if you observe synchronicities, and it tells us something about what you are talking about, temporal depth in your model. It looks as some people have more temporal depth. Anyway, it raises questions not just of perception. It raises question about reality, that's of course, but it raises question about the nature of time.
Yes, certainly from a phenomenological point of view, definitely. Yeah, no, very interesting. Thank you.
I will give you the reference of the paper.
Yes, thank you.
I have it somewhere.
Yeah.
Thank you, Annie, for your comment. And Murillo.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I have seen predictive coding floating around, but I have not yet studied it. So I'm not very familiar with it yet.
It's a commitment.
Yeah. So, but could you maybe tell us something about where do prior expectations come from?
Yes.
And in the short term, I can you can say, okay, it's from your prior experience. But then thinking about the ontogeny of the organism from a zygote to a child, I'm concerned that if we go back, you might at one point have to say, well, the initial prior expectations are encoded in the genes, and then I would find that problematic. I don't know what you think about that.
So yes, I do think that some priors that have been accrued through phylogenesis, because have been somehow sedimented into the genome. So the genomes can be cast as an informational deposit of the irregularities that the species encounter in that niche. But it's interesting because I would like to know why you think that is problematic. In fact, there is some biologists that actually translated the concept of free energy minimization into the evolutionary realm, where it's called now free fitness instead of free energy, but it's basically the same thing. But tell me, I'm curious, because I don't know actually much about that. So
yeah, I'm not a specialist myself, but I think a similar argument was made against the notion of representations, because in order to make sense of the representations, the homunculus need to have prior
exactly knowledge. So that's why, yeah, that is a good point. That's why what I'm saying is that it's not that the organism has a generative model that is a set of representation. It's actually that by interacting with its environment, its internal dynamics comes to represent, but not represent for somebody. The very organism becomes a representation, and becomes a representation of what? Not of the entities. That's why I talked about codependent origination, but of the causal chains of events that it encounters in this world. Just like, let's say, a rock that is in a stream gets levigated and somehow represents the flow of water, but in this case it's an active rock, so its interaction with the water is much richer, and so it creates internally a much more structured organization and dynamics.
Okay, so the criticism about the role of the genes in development. So the discussion is a bit, how does form arise in organisms? And the idea that form arises by being already existed in the genome and then translated in development is problematic for reasons that maybe I don't know that I can be concise here. But one basic argument is that whatever effect a piece of DNA might have depends on the context in which it is materially interacting, chemically interacting. And therefore you cannot assign form to the DNA alone, irrespective of the interactions that it actually engage during development.
Yes. But these interactions are usually fairly constrained. That is, they're variable from individual to individual, but they remain, let's say, bounded. And the fact that they remain bounded means that they amount to a sort of an attractor, of a pullback attractor, so that the system cannot go too far out of these states.
But then the attractor is defined not by the gene, or by the genome as a whole, but by the genome in relation to the rest of the cells, in relation to the rest of the organism, in relation to the environment.
Of course. But these kind of priors are actually, I think, they are sedimented along different temporal scales. So there are the one that pertains to the phylogenesis scale and in the genome, that of course are not so malleable, obviously. And then there are the ones that form with the along a much shorter temporal scale. And these are, of course, much more amenable to change. But you're right. I mean, in that representation of the genome, I think we must also include as a set of defining priors the possible states, the possible internal states of, that generate the interaction of the genome and give rise to epigenetics, I guess.
Okay, I do have another question, but I'll let
Sure.
others jump in and then I'll come back.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Murillo. I can see Bruce Bau's question or comment in the chat. Bruce, would you like to share that? Maybe you posted two, probably.
That's very interesting. Yeah.
Was associated with Murillo's question, but please feel free, and then we can see Fabien's hand as well. So you will have time for two questions at least.
Right. Thank you very much for your talk. I have read your book, Active Inference, that you wrote in combination with Thomas Parr and Carl Friston.
That was not me. That was not me. I wish it was me. That's Giovanni Pezzulo.
Oh dear, what a shame, because I was going to compliment Friston in his introduction.
I haven't read it yet.
Not all right. Well, I'm sure if you had written it, it would have been as well.
Well, thank you.
Obviously, active inference is one model of some aspects of mind-brain activity. In the last question, you've already started to discuss a priori perceptions and their role, and in recent Mind and Life Europe discussions, we have looked at a converse view in which the world is considered a perceptual representation of the organism rather than the way you've presented it. So I'm just wondering whether, in fact, active inference is the most appropriate model to apply to meditation. Meditative practices focus on the present moment, very much so. Most practices are designed to bring you into the present moment, which about which you made comments, what William James called the specious present. And of course, the present is always informed by the past in the stream of consciousness, including established belief systems. But the whole purpose of meditation is actually to examine the present moment experience in such a way that there's a possibility of change rather than reinforcement of predicted established belief systems, which of course leads to the possibility of creativity rather than neural regression and reversion to simpler systems. So I'm just wondering.
Yes, no, I agree. I do agree with that.
Is one way in which mind-brain is being explored, and particularly computationally with an interest in artificial intelligence. But I wonder if it is in fact, its assumptions are such that it's possibly not the most appropriate model to apply to meditation.
It may be. To me, it is a very interesting approach to understand contemplative practices. I think what I wanted to highlight when I talked about attention to the present is that type of that notion may be frequently misunderstood, because as you said, the present is specious, and so it means that it's always informed by the past and also informed by the future also. And in that sense, I feel that what you said about being attentive to the present in a way that we are in meditation, I think means being open to how both the past and the future activates the present in a sense. So there is no, the idea, what I defined working regress, it's not, I said it's not simply reverting to a simpler system. Actually, it may be the opposite neurally. It may be to not, because the system already gets simpler by virtue of our agential skills, because we tend to fashion our world exactly as we predict. So the model becomes, after a while, becomes simpler. The fact is, the idea is providing a countermeasure to that. So let's say, if our belief system is, our belief landscape is characterized by a few very tall peaks, the idea is to flatten the landscape a little bit more so that we can explore latent alternatives that are usually neglected. So I don't know if I answered your first question. Your second question, I definitely agree. I mean, it's not an exclusive view. So the world as well can be considered a perceptual representation of the organism that, I mean, a niche is a perceptual, let's say it's a representation, a perceptual. It may not be completely true, but it's a representation, in fact, of the organisms that live in that niche. And in fact, my picture of the colibri, what's called the bird that was feeding on the nectar of that flower, where the shape of the flower, it's true, one could say the shape of the beak of the bird adapted to the shape of the flower, but we know that it's also the reverse. It's also the flower that adapted its shape to the beak of the bird. Why? Because if it had a shape like that, it was more likely to be pollinated by, and so acquired greater fitness. So it's definitely true both, but coevolution, exactly.
Well, interdependence,
yes,
which is an important point when you're considering the human mind in relation both as embodied and inactive in the external world. You are looking at a system of interdependence, and what you have just done is shown that in the present moment we can bring different belief systems, different assumptions to the present moment. But the wonderful thing is that we only have the present moment, but we can use the present moment to weigh up different belief systems and which ones, with the experience and knowledge gained in the present moment, as to which direction we wish to proceed into the future.
yes.
And this, of course, gives the opportunity for creativity rather than regression, because we don't have to entrench any one particular belief system, and we have the opportunity of change.
Yes, no, I agree. Maybe there's a more technical aspect that I perhaps neglected to say, that is by paying attention and fully embodied attention to the present moment in meditation, what we do is usually to shift precision towards the lower layers of the generative hierarchical model. So the one closer to the sensory surfaces. And by doing that, since the process is always a trade-off between beliefs and sensory system, by doing so, we momentarily depotentiate the the strength and the power of our established set of beliefs, and that practice may render this set of beliefs more fluid, more malleable, thereby, promoting creativity, as you said, or flexibility.
Which is why we attempt to bring mindfulness, if you like, or the meditative moment into experience, so that we don't actually follow our traditional belief systems and follow our automatic behavior, but we actually take a moment to pause and to consider the extent to which the belief system is carrying us forward. And I think you reference the default mode network in terms of mind wandering. That is a term only used by those who believe that attention is the most important thing, and that you have to remain attentive on the topic that you consciously choose to. In fact, the activation of the default mode network and its reference to the salience network and previous experience actually provides the opportunity within a moment of equanimity to change that direction and gives the opportunity for creativity.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree.
Anyway, thank you. Thank
you very much.
Thank you, Bruce. I think, Giuseppe, your point on work in regress was actually to highlight that it's not a simplification of the generative model.
Exactly.
So your argument there was very, very precise and very, very concrete. And in that sense, I think Bruce's comments and his point lead to the same conclusion, although the language in which you formulated it would be different. But your point was the same, I think.
Yes.
Leading to creativity and not simplification.
I agree.
Fabienne, we can still have little time for your question and comment, please.
Thank you, Giuseppe, for this amazing presentation.
Thank you.
Actually, you just answered my question before. My question was about the effect of contemplative practice. Is it more on the generation of predictions or more on the precision? And you just answered.
Okay. Okay, good.
So thank you very much.
No, thank you.
So I would like to thank you, Giuseppe, for your really thought-provoking, deep, and substantive, as I called it, substantive talk. We need more talks like this, as it shows our friends in the Mind and Life Europe Friends community are really eager to hear such talks and depth, combining science and also contemplative practice. So thank you for that. And
thank you for inviting me. Thank you all, for staying with me in this long talk.
No, it was not long at all. It was very interesting. And I would like to thank you all for participating, joining, and just give us a little second to invite you to our next events. Johanna, you may want to take over. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you again, Giuseppe, for a really rich and also pedagogical talk. I found it really clear. So everyone is invited to all of the upcoming events, actually, because you're all MLE friends. So the next event is actually next Wednesday at 6 p.m. with Michel Bitbol, and he'll be offering a live Q&A session, which is actually a follow-up to the 7 episodes of the webinar that he recorded this spring and that we have offered specifically to the MLE Friends community. So it's the second of the series. It's on consciousness from both an Eastern and Western perspective. And having watched at least a couple of times the entire series, it really is an excellent introduction, but beyond an introduction. So I recommend attending the Q&A next Wednesday. And then in a couple of weeks, we'll actually have the honor of inviting Sokni Rinpoche, who will be contributing to the Franciscan Friends seminar. So it'll be a very personal and poignant talk where he'll reflect on his early relationship with Francisco Varela and specifically the both the dharmic aspect and also the scientific aspect. And so his encounter with both aspects of Varela's life and work. So that's April 20th at 4 p.m. So 16 hours Central European time. It's a different time from our usual time. And then finally, we'll be inviting another association member, so Dr. Luisa Damiano, to be offering a talk also on her most recent research on social robotics on the edges of brain, body, and environment. So that'll be at the same time, 6 p.m. as usual, followed by a live Q&A. So you're all welcome to join us for all three of these events, or one or two as you wish. So thank you again to everyone, and have a great evening.
Thank you, and good night to everybody.
Thank you once again. Thank you.